There we go. Now I'm recording. We also ask that you please keep yourself muted so we don't experience any static or feedback. We will open up to some questions and answers at the end. So we will make everybody aware of when you can unmute yourself at the end. Okay, so today's webinar is part 2 of our 3-part series. Back in the summer, on July 28th, CEDACOG partnered with the State Hazard Mitigation Officer of the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency to deliver part 1, our presentation, Flood Mitigation Grant Assistance. We thank you if you participated in our July event and are here again with us today. We will have more information available on the last slide related to the 3rd and final part of our series. This webinar is brought to you by the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission Water Resource Center in partnership with CEDA Council of Governments, or CEDACOG. CEDACOG would like to extend a special thank you to Erin Keppel-Adams of SPC's Water Resource Center. Without her partnership and organization of this event, we would not be here today. So thank you again, Erin. Something that Erin has asked us to mention is if you, our folks in the audience here today, or your organization have any ideas for future workshop topics, please contact Erin Keppel-Adams at the email included here on the bottom of the left-hand portion in that red box on the slide. Speaking of slides, today's presentation will be made available to our registration list as well as posted to SPC's website along with the recording of today's session. We will be monitoring the chat box periodically, so please add your questions in there and we will do our best to answer the questions as soon as we can. To introduce some of our speakers here, I am going to go a little bit backwards on this slide here, but I am Jerilee Ziegler. I am a flood resiliency program analyst here at CEDACOG. I have worked in this position at the agency since November of 2019. I started working at CEDACOG in 2017, and in my 4-year career, I started in our community development program, where I assisted and prepared a variety of grant applications, as well as assumed responsibilities related to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, environmental review process, as well as state and federal labor standards compliance and project management. Also joining me today is Terry Provost. Terry is the Director of Housing Rehabilitation and Flood Resiliency at CEDACOG. During her 15-year career at CEDACOG, 9 years were within the community development program. She prepared numerous grant applications and is very experienced in managing housing and urban development programs. Terry has also developed and managed public works projects throughout the central Pennsylvania counties that CEDACOG serves. So we do serve an 11-county region here at CEDACOG. Additionally, Terry is a certified floodplain manager, or a CFM, and has administered several state and federally funded buyouts and residential elevation projects in our flood-prone communities. The focus of today's webinar will be specific to 6 residential flood mitigation efforts, along with their respective importance. Each of those 6 flood mitigation efforts will explore the benefits and the drawbacks, items for consideration when evaluating the pros and cons for these efforts, essentially. These 6 mitigation efforts will be considered as non-structural mitigation types versus the structural, meaning our focus today is on the residential side of what people can do on a personal level to reduce their flood damage by altering their property or obtaining flood insurance. We will not be focusing on the structural level for flood mitigation efforts today. Some examples of structural flood mitigation types would be those of bridges, dams, levees, dikes, or flood control structures. We do have some photos at the end for some of these 6 flood mitigation efforts as well, for those who may want to see some photos. But now I will be passing it over to Terry to start our discussion on the non-structural considerations.
Thank you, Shirley. There was going to be a little bit of time where the firm took to load, but I am happy to be here today to kind of go over some of these non-structural considerations. In front of you, what you have is a flood insurance rate map. Now, of course, FEMA has kind of gotten quite a bit better with their mapping services. If you go to msc.fema.gov, you will find the flood maps. This is an old digitized firm. And it is used actually for compliance with the municipality's floodplain ordinance. So we're a little special in Pennsylvania. In the Commonwealth, we are municipally driven, meaning that each municipality must, to be in the National Flood Insurance Program and have a community identification number, they must be part of the NFIP. And in order to do that, they must do 2 things: pass a resolution and then pass an ordinance. And that ordinance essentially is the floodplain ordinance. That ordinance allows, it has a lot of teeth and enforcement behind that, but the enforcement is essentially to ensure that they are using the firm that you see on the right-hand side for compliance matters. So there's a couple things to think about. If you're using any sort of grant funds, or your municipality would like to use grant funds to assist you as a property owner, they must be participating in the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. So that means they've adopted a floodplain ordinance. Additionally, with other grant funding sources, there's legislation under the National Flood Insurance Program that mandates that a community to have federally backed mortgages must be participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And grant funding agencies like FEMA and the Housing and Urban Development HUD mandate that if we use grant funds in the special flood hazard area, that they're actually an NFIP community as well. So each community that is part of the National Flood Insurance Program, in particular in Pennsylvania, would be municipally driven. So each municipality has, if they're in that program, they have a community identification number. You can actually go right to Google, type in community identification number under NFIP, and you can find that code. I believe it's a 7-digit code for the community identification number. So in a nutshell, if a community is suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program, then they could call back all those federal mortgages. If you have a mortgage on your home and your community has been suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program, there are large repercussions to the entire municipality and their residents. In the floodplain ordinance that each municipality may adopt to become part of the National Flood Insurance Program participating community, there are a couple prong approach to this. If there is substantial damage or substantial improvements to a structure in the special flood hazard area, then they must make a determination if it exceeds 50% of the fair market value. So substantial damage could mean anything like a fire, a flood, a car running off the road and hitting a structure. If there's 50% or more damage of the fair market value of that structure, that is considered a substantial damage structure, and it must come into compliance with your floodplain ordinance, essentially meaning you need to elevate that structure above the base flood elevation, or what we call the BFE. Historic structures have a designation in floodplain ordinances that allow them an exemption from the substantial damage, substantial improvement protocol through the floodplain ordinance. So what that means is if you have a large historic designation, sometimes you'll see this in communities, especially longstanding communities, where they have a very large downtown that's designated as a historic area. In these cases, those structures that may be located in the special flood hazard area that may have substantial damage, they do not need to bring those structures into compliance with today's base flood elevation, like elevation, because there's a long-standing agreement between the historic properties having that look and appeal to ensure that we have that integrity based on the Interior Secretary of Standards of those historic designations. So with flood insurance, since 1960 and the NFIP authorization, we have been doing flood insurance very similarly throughout the years. There's been some changes with the Bigger Waters Act, and then again with the Homeowner Affordability Act under the NFIP program. However, within the last, I believe this was October 1st, Risk Rating 2.0 went into effect. We were hoping for it in the last 2 years, but it finally went in effect in October. The biggest thing to take away from the previous slide and this slide is essentially that, yes, there's a two-prong approach with flood insurance. You must use your FIRM, your flood insurance rate map that we showed you on the last screen for compliance. However, for the insurance underwriting portion, we are now using Risk Rating 2.0. That updates really the methodology and how we implement the underwriting of your flood insurance. Before, we could pull down the flood insurance book and calculate your premiums of your structure. We can no longer do that with Risk Rating 2.0, but we have an example for the zip code 15201 for the Pittsburgh area below here on the bottom left. And there's been a lot of discussion about elevation certificates. And I have to tell you, I have been a huge supporter of, with flood maps, if you're located in the special flood hazard area and you believe that you really should not be, or you have no idea what your risk is or your insurance premiums, why they're the way they are, we have always been supporters of getting an elevation certificate. However, with Risk Rating 2.0, that is still a question mark that we have. We have sought some FEMA guidance with that, but it is still a question mark that I can't quite answer if elevation certificates really will help your policy premiums with Risk Rating 2.0. So with that bottom box, Shirley, if you don't mind just going back quickly, what we have seen are there's some changes in premium dollars. So this is showing you your zip code in the Pittsburgh area and really what kind of increases we've seen in the NFIP policy. For the most part, what we've seen statewide is an increase between $0 and $20 on most folks' premium dollars on their NFIP policies. So not a very large change. What Risk Rating 2.0 tried to do was really figure out what your structure, not if you're located in and out like we used to do. We used to actually only use the firm for even insurance underwriting purposes. But with Risk Rating 2.0, we are looking at a lot of other matrices, including if they think you have a basement, if you're on a graded area, if you're on a hill and you might not get inundated like they thought based on the firm. So I thought that was important to touch those points. It is new and it is something we all really need to become familiar with as they deploy Risk Rating 2.0. So the 6 flood mitigation types and techniques that we're going to talk about today include a couple things. Some of these are my favorites. I've seen a lot of these. Others are pilots that we're trying to do in the state of Pennsylvania currently. Raising utilities and mechanicals. That is pretty simple to do. We'll go through the drawbacks and benefits of that as well. And based on the old insurance premium ratings, it was a 0.06% reduction in your loaded calculation of your insurance, meaning that you would save some insurance, but ultimately you're still located in the special flood hazard area. We're also going to talk about basement infilling, and I think we might have at least a case story to share with you on that one. Abandoning the first floor, structural elevation, relocation of structures. And the last one is the one that we're trying to pilot a little bit in the Commonwealth under grant programs currently, the mitigation and reconstruction. This is where your home might be sitting in the special flood hazard area, but you may have a part of your parcel that is located outside of the regulatory floodplain. That 100-year floodplain is what we mean by the special flood hazard area. If your parcel is large enough, or pieces of your parcel, even if it's small, are located outside of that regulatory floodplain, taking your home and actually moving it is what we're looking at. So raising utilities and mechanicals. There are some programs that will allow us to use grant funding to raise utilities and mechanicals. The best program I have seen to do this is through the housing program HOME, which is a HUD program. Home allows full-blown housing rehabilitation along with elevation of utilities and mechanicals in the special flood hazard area. Beyond that, this is typically funded with private dollars. A homeowner may say, yes, my electrical panel is located below the base flood elevation. I'd like to elevate that because I lose it year after year after year. The benefits could reduce future losses to items that are costly to replace repeatedly. The option to help homeowners stay in their homes and maintain the same exact tax base. The drawbacks are that you're still located in the special flood hazard area. You're not going to see large premium savings, but you're going to see the ability to bounce back from flood events very quickly because you no longer have to fix the same things, your hot water heaters, your electrical panels, and those types of things. Basement infilling, Shirley, I think it's back to you.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Terry. So moving on to basement infilling, when we do this technique, it involves abandoning your lowest floor and then backfilling it to the necessary height required to make your next highest floor the new lowest floor. So we talk a lot of back and forth about this floor and that floor. But after you would abandon your basement and relocate any of your utilities, your mechanicals, your foundation slab would be perforated to allow the flood water to move freely in and out of your foundation. Then your basement would be backfilled, compact soil, pea gravel, flowable fill to that required height, and then capped with concrete so you have an impermeable slab. What you get is an area between the new slab and your next highest floor that would create a crawl space that would give you, provided that you would get the proper venting to allow the passage of floodwaters to move freely back and forth. Then your next highest floor would now become your lowest floor. So you would be above that BFE. So this is an effective mitigation technique when and where your BFE is higher than the lowest floor, but below that next highest or your first floor. So your benefits, this could be a desirable option when appropriate for homes whose construction would be very difficult to elevate. There are some homes that may not be structurally sound to be lifted to that appropriate level. So it would be keeping the home there, but allowing still having that flood water flowing freely. Again, this is very attractive for historic homes or historic districts, which would help maintain your historic integrity and the aesthetic character. Some examples in communities where you have historic designation, if you elevate a certain amount of homes, you would kind of get a different effect of up and down homes. So in this situation for historic homes, it would still allow them to be close to the ground, but flood mitigated. The disturbance to homeowners would be very minimal other than your loss of storage space. And it's very desirable from our municipalities because it retains your tax base in keeping that home occupiable. Now, our drawbacks would be your loss of storage space in the basements. I know here in central Pennsylvania, we really like our basements and enjoy our basements. And then we would need to accommodate some elevated mechanicals on the upper floors. So having that M&E, whether that be in a closet or another space of the home, you would then lose that potential storage space. So we consider that a drawback. Care must be given to ensure that the resulting crawl space meets the FEMA requirements of a crawl space, so of their actual technical definition. So if the space is too high, it may be classified as a basement. So that would give you less effect on the resulting flood insurance premium that you may be seeking or going after. And the crawl space must be properly flood vented to receive that credit for the FEMA requirements of a crawl space. Another drawback could be cost. A technique like this, certain types of infill material that are used could contribute to some variability. On this, abandoning the first floor. So this is similar but separate to your basement infilling. So your lowest floor, which would be at or near grade, would be abandoned. And then your living space would be moved up to your next highest floor. That abandoned floor is then converted to open space that is compliant with all FEMA regulations, including the proper flood venting and non-conversion compliance to livable space. In a situation where you are abandoning your first floor, if you have a basement, it can be infilled to the same regard as we previously mentioned on basement infilling. This mitigation technique is more attractive when you have the BFE, your base flood elevation, located above your elevated first floor, regardless if there is a basement. So our benefits and drawbacks here that we focus on, again, something that we hammer home is retaining that tax base. It is so important to a lot of our communities. Abandonment of the first floor is typically less expensive and less disruptive to the homeowner, as you have no elevation. So you can still exist, live, occupy your home, and not have to leave that structure, whereas you would in an elevation situation. A benefit, if allowable, additional floors could be added to the top of the structure to offset the cost of living space. Abandoning a floor may negatively impact the structure's historical designation. It would have a minimal impact on the aesthetics of the community, though. That could be adverse to that pure structural elevation. A drawback for abandoning your first floor is that loss of living space, especially if you are unable to add any additional floors to the top of the home or another top floor space of the home. Basement infill would need to be completed to the compliance of the FEMA regulations. An abandoned flood would need to remain open, and the living space would need to be compliant. On our last slide here, and I do apologize, we did not have a ton of room on these slides, but we do have pictures toward the end of a home locally here, close to where we are in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, where the home actually had the basement infilled, and they additionally abandoned the first floor of this home. It is a beautiful, beautiful home. We were able to tour it this summer, where it used to be occupiable space. It now could potentially be a garage, and they also have added a bathroom in there, as well as stairs that then go to the second floor, the next highest floor, their livable space. And I believe they were able to add on, I can't remember if the deck portion of the home was added on when they had abandoned the first floor. But again, it's truly beautiful. We'll make sure that we point that out to you at the end of our slides. And now we're going to move on to the structural elevation. And with that, Terry, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks. So structural elevation has to be one of my favorite non-structural mitigation types. We see a lot of structural elevations, and we're hopeful that you have seen quite a few. We see these a lot, obviously, in Louisiana, piers and posts, but in central Pennsylvania, what we typically see and across the Commonwealth, we don't have a lot of that coastal surge here. We see a lot of concrete masonry units, not posts and piers. So sometimes if you drive by, other than it looks a little bit higher than the rest of the homes, you may not actually realize that it's an elevated structure. These can be accomplished obviously privately. You can fund these structural elevations on your own. The things that are really the biggest caveats about elevating a structure is knowing that the first thing you might have to deal with beyond getting it designed and going through the permitting process is really zoning. The biggest lift on a structural elevation from the homeowner perspective or the grant funding agency is to make sure that you're thinking about your setbacks and your variances. Some communities actually have height restrictions when you elevate a home. So what does an elevation look like? There's several different companies that provide that jacking of the home. So basically what they do is they lift the home from the foundation and they jack the entire structure above the base flood elevation. At this point in time, once they do that, is really important. It has to be one of the most important things to do is to have your codes official come out and your floodplain manager come out and ensure that it is elevated above the base flood elevation. The existing basement is then infilled, it's like compacted down, and basically then the home is released back onto the support system. So you actually build in your concrete masonry units. You jack up your home, you fill in the basement, and you start to build your concrete masonry above the base flood elevation. If piers and piles are used, water can flow freely during an event, and some folks really like the look of a pier or piles, and not so much the CMUs. And I've had the question asked, why don't we do it more here? And the reason really is we like our basements. Jerry just said that a lot of folks, and we have, different kinds of storm surges as well. We don't have that coastal wave action. So really having those flood vents and the new CMUs, concrete masonry units that are built up, will have flood venting in those. And you are not allowed to use your basement for anything but storage, essentially, storage parking. At that point in time, the house is considered compliant with the ordinance. And that proper flood venting allows that hydrostatic pressure to allow floodwaters come in and recede. So you have to have flood vents that have no manual operation needs. It has to slowly move in and out. It cannot wait for a homeowner to come home and open up the vents. A lot of vents we see are engineered venting, and there is a requirement in ordinance of what kinds of venting per square foot that you must use. The remaining open space below the elevated structure can be used for storage or parking, but cannot be converted into any type of livable space. It has to be uninhabitable. And if you're using any type of FEMA grant funds, there are deed restrictions that go along, including that it must be uninhabitable space, even if you sell your home. The benefits to a structural elevation, there's a lot of those. There's no loss of space to the homeowner. The homeowner actually doesn't have to move out their materials. You can leave everything where it was, your washer and dryer, your couch. You yourself would have to be displaced during that event when the house is being elevated, but you are likely displaced or relocated out of your home for less than about 60 days. So that is a drawback, but you don't lose any space to your home. Most high dollar items that would be adversely affected during a flood event, like your hot water heater, your air conditioning unit, your electrical panels, are all elevated when the home is elevated as well. It's part of the design work that would take place. Everything will be above the base flood elevation. It retains that municipality's tax base, and the structure is a lot more marketable, and premiums are truly more affordable. We have an example a little bit later. I think it's a little mind-blowing to see your house is still located in the special flood hazard area. You look on a map for compliance, you're still in the special flood hazard area. You still have to be in compliance, but you are in compliance because you have the flood venting, you're elevated above the base flood elevation. And so it's a win-win for the municipality and the homeowner. The biggest downfalls are really, the EMA side of things, your loss of property and life. They're not zero mitigated, meaning that you still could be trapped in your home during a flood event. You're still located in the special flood hazard area. Your house is very high, but if something, catastrophic events do happen, if you need to get out of your home, you are putting yourself and the emergency managers and rescue personnel into compromising situations. So the major drawback is that it is a little bit of a high cost if you're doing this privately with your own private dollars. Proper elevations require careful consideration with an engineer, and the actual shoring and jacking of the structure is best done by experienced specialty contractors. And usually you will see this niche. We have a probably a half dozen contractors that I'm very familiar with that do this type of work across the Commonwealth. Grant funding is the most common for homeowners who carry the National Flood Insurance Program. And this is through the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant that your municipality can go after for funding, but you must be an NFIP policy holder in order to play in the game, and it has to go through the municipality to PEMA and then FEMA, because the National Flood Insurance premium pays for part of that grant, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant. So if you have private grant funding, there is not the Flood Mitigation Assistance funding available to your municipality, but it would be available to those residents who have the National Flood Insurance program premiums paid in. Grant funding priority is placed on acquisition demolition. It is actually one of the highest ranked under the FMA, the Flood Mitigation Assistance. That grant funding has been around for quite a while, and it is open every federal fiscal year, October 1. And it has quite a bit of a set aside year to year. Under the new administration, there is more dollars for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program than there had been previously. Elevations aren't quite as competitive as acquisition demolitions under the FMA, but they basically take second place to acquisition demolition. With the need for state and federal requirements, we do have to add some layers here. There's a requirement for bonding, state wage rates, and it can make it much more expensive than if you were to do this on your own, but it's paid for entirely by grant funds. Obviously, there's some sort of a perceived unnatural look with elevations in Pennsylvania from time to time. In other areas that you may travel to, you will see that it's a very natural look because all of the homes are elevated. And so it becomes a natural look when you take blocks of homes and you elevate those homes. It does pose a little bit of a challenge with historic buildings as well. Structural elevation, if the building is historic, there are typically different ways we want to look at that other than an elevation. Elevations take away from that structural integrity of that historic home. It does also pose a challenge for folks with limited mobility. Obviously, the more you elevate a home, the more stairs you have to climb, ramps. Now we have included chairlifts in some of ours as well for limited mobility folks. So this is a structural elevation example, and I have to be very transparent here. This was based on the insurance premium calculations that we could do prior to risk rating 2.0. So this might look a little different in today's world. As of October 1st, that we indicated risk rating 2.0 went into effect, but prior to that, we could actually do all the calculations on flood insurance. So we could take a preform structure in the regular program, look at where the lowest floor is on the base flood elevation, and then start elevating that structure with the concrete masonry units with proper flood venting. And what happens is we have some cost variations here. If you did this privately, you're looking at between $40,000 and $80,000. If you do this with federal or state money, you're looking at about $100,000 to $200,000. The effect on an NFIP policy, excuse me, prior to elevation was $4,093. That's what they were paying every year on flood insurance. After the elevation, they were paying $530 per year on their elevated structure, which is a huge savings. So any mitigation would be contained in the elevation certificate, which is not considered when calculating private insurance policy premiums. So what we're trying to say here is that this is all considering national flood insurance policy premiums, not private insurance. Sometimes private insurance does not even look at an elevation certificate. It is relatively new, that private insurance market, but they are starting to open up more and more initiatives under that private market to take things like elevation certificates into account. So here's some just illustration purposes if you really want to get in the meat of how to actually multiply previous to the risk rating 2.0, a calculation. Prior to the elevation, you will see the total amount due was $4,696, and after was $598. And the interesting part here is that you'll see where some of these premiums really come down. Basically, on your even building side of things, your premium calculation went from essentially $2,834 just for your basic coverage on the building to $292, which is crazy. Now you have to add in your deductible, your ICC, which is increased cost for compliance. If you have the National Flood Insurance Program, you pay for the increased cost of compliance. It's a rider on all NFIP policies. And that ICC cost is calculated based on the premiums, that dollars, and that increased cost of compliance really means if you got substantially damaged as a structure under NFIP, and your municipality is going to mandate you to bring your home into compliance to elevate that home, the ICC actually helps pay for that elevation of your structure to come into compliance. That is maxed out currently at $30,000. So that is a pool of funds that you can tap into as a homeowner if you have substantial damage to help bring your home into full-blown compliance with a floodplain ordinance to get your home elevated above the base flood elevation. Relocation of a structure. I think this is also me. Or is it you, Jerry? I'm going to toss it back to you.
Thank you. Yep, it's me. So stepping away from our structural elevation side of things, the consideration of relocating the structure. So in a relocation of a flood-prone structure, it's a form of flood mitigation accomplished merely by moving your structure out of the floodplain. A key piece here, as we keep hitting on, is it retains your tax base. However, you can hit some expensive costs as well as some constraints that we will touch on in the next slide. If this is an attractive option, something that makes sense for your structure in relocating it, you could also consider a LOMA, a letter of map amendment. Now, after the structure is relocated, you could go through the application process in submitting certain mapping, surveying information to FEMA. What FEMA then does is issues the documentation officially removing your property and or structure from the special flood hazard area, the SFHA. So a person that would be applying for a LOMA, they would likely need to hire a licensed land surveyor or registered professional engineer or architect to prepare an EC of the property. With this, again, it preserves the tax base provided that the relocation is still within your municipal limits. Relocating can be used to mitigate a historically significant structure, again, by maintaining that historic value and your aesthetic integrity. So it would just be taking that structure from over here and moving it there. It wouldn't be changing it, again, like Terry had said, in a structural elevation. So it keeps that aesthetic look, it keeps it appealing. A drawback when we consider the relocation of a structure, again, it could be an attractive mitigation strategy, but relocating is extremely expensive, we find. It's a procedure that requires careful coordination, and you would really need some specialty contractors, folks that know what they're doing. You put a lot of hope and faith in those individuals or firms that would be moving that structure for you. Relocation has some limitations. It requires that you have a suitable location outside of the SFHA, your regulatory floodplain. Many of the effective structures, what we find here in central Pennsylvania, sit on what we call a postage stamp size parcel. So we have limited space where you can relocate that structure on that same postage size, square rectangular parcel. Furthermore, many parcels, they lack the necessary elevation change to move the structure out of the floodplain and above the BFE. So simply lacking enough space outside of the SFHA. Not that we want to be naysayers here, but while relocating, shouldn't be ruled out as an effective mitigation strategy, it's just knowing that you have certain constraints and items that need to be considered for the work, and lack of suitable opportunities within the region to regulate the relocation to a less desirable option at the present time. And Terry, I believe this is back to you.
Sure. And this technique is totally different than what Jerry was just talking about. Mitigation reconstruction is actually when you have some sort of structure on a parcel of land, and you're going to either completely destroy it, demolish it, but you're going to remove that building or partial building totally out, and you're going to demolish it, clear away, and then you're going to bring in new housing on the same parcel outside of the special flood hazard area. Now, I have seen this done. This was actually done, and I'm sure you all may have seen this as well, but you'll actually see a structure, and it could even be, it could look from the outside that it's in decent shape. However, there are some benefit cost analysis that are done, especially with grant programs and your own private dollars. Does this make sense for me to do this? In the federal eyes, there's that benefit cost analysis that says, does this make sense for us to grant funds to this activity? Sometimes you will have a home that has so many code deficiencies that may look okay on the outside, that's located in the special flood hazard area, but ultimately to elevate that home, it's going to be more costly than just to demolish it and bring in per se a prefab building with the CMUs, the concrete masonry units, built above the BFE, and then lay the prefab up on those CMUs. So what we see is a house or a partial structure demolished, a new house brought in or being built, not in the same exact footprint, but outside of the footprint and outside of the special flood hazard area. We have not seen a lot of this in the state, but we have seen some examples crop up. And I have actually been part of just one of these mitigation reconstruction activities, but it does make for a very nice home for especially low to moderate income folks to live in outside the special flood hazard area. And it does reduce their risk totally of flooding. Because now you're outside, well, not totally, but outside the special flood hazard area. What happens is, yes, you always have the risk, but you're not going to be paying those large premium dollars for flood insurance. You could flood, sure, but you're outside of that special flood hazard area. So it's a real big win-win for the homeowner, and it makes a lot of sense for a lot of folks. And I think we have some examples to show you. Here on the top left, Jerry, do you want to take the top left photos and we'll kind of bounce back and forth?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. So in the situation where I was discussing the basement infilling or abandoning your first floor, the top left photos here, the White House, that's the situation that I was talking about. Now, while we don't have the photos of the inside, what is located in the top left photo, there are some garage doors back there. So there's a driveway, and the homeowner could then park in that first floor, then leaving that as some storage space, leaving that as some parking space. Again, I had mentioned that they have installed a bathroom, and then there's a set of steps that then go up to the second floor for the livable space. And what you can see here is they've added on the deck in the second picture there. So they still can enjoy the outside air, and have added on some space to that home as well. So it's quite an attractive home. It's very, very well done. This was not completed with grant funding. Private funds have been used for this project. And I think that that's all that I really have to say about that one, Terry.
Thank you. On the top right, the photos of the brick home, this was an elevation completed with grant funds. This was actually HMGP funds, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funds. This house, the top three pictures, the brick home, this was just simply an elevation of a structure. I say simply, and this is actually quite expensive elevation with brick and the CMU walls. They are located very close to the floodway, but they are not in the floodway. They are in the special flood hazard area. They get inundated over and over and over. And throughout the years, they do carry National Flood Insurance Program policy. This house was elevated about 1.5 feet above the base flood elevation. For insurance purposes, when we elevate 1.5 feet above the base flood elevation, that is actually in the state code. PA Act 166 mandates that we elevate at minimum 1.5 feet above the base flood elevation. The federal requirement is just base flood elevation, but since we are in the Commonwealth, we must elevate at least 1.5 feet above, which is what this home has done. When they did that, they actually received, it rounds up in the flood insurance premium side, and we actually see a 2-foot credit above the base flood elevation. So they save quite a bit of money on their flood insurance. And I would ballpark this one at about $5,000 before the elevation, about a year, and about $400 to $500 a year still. So they are still located in the special flood hazard area. They have flood venting, which you may not be able to see in these photos, but it is fully compliant flood venting. And there was a lot of variance and zoning issues with this one as well. So there are some setbacks that had to be dealt with in this area. And then the last couple of photos are really before and after photos of recent acquisition demolitions of structures with hazard mitigation grant program dollars. This is through the Stafford Act. These are actually tied back to the July and August events of 2018. And we have quite a bit of COVID stimulus funds under the hazard mitigation grant program open currently in the Commonwealth, but these are all acquisition demolitions. So they were all afforded fair market value through an appraisal for their home. It is a voluntary participation transaction. They all voluntarily went through this program, and their homes were acquired and demoed. Now these homes some of these are just partial. The bottom picture will show you at the end of this, in like the maroon area, it has to be totally leveled. It is seated. It does not look it like that maybe in the photo, but it is seated, and there are perpetuity deed restrictions indicating that we must follow 44 CFR 80, which basically says you can't do anything in this area. It had grant funds to be acquired, demolished because there's so much flooding here, but there are some basic things that you're allowed to do. Anything that's functionally dependent in the floodplain, like bridges, maybe a boat launch. You can also do some type of nature activity area, but you cannot have structures in this area any longer. And we do want to open up for some questions, but first and foremost, there is another presentation that SPC will be working with us on. That is on December 15th from 12 to 1. It's a Wednesday, and this is much different. It's actually the flip side of what we talked about today. It is flood management for non-residential structures. So the very opposite of what we discussed today. It's much more on the commercial side, commercial grant funding, commercial mitigation as well. And our contact information is here. I know we're a little early. We're about 10 minutes early, so we'd like to open up for some questions or thoughts and see if there's anything we can help you with.
It sounds like we have somebody that has unmuted themselves.
Yeah, I have a quick question. In your experience, what has been the most effective way to connect this information that you have on flood mitigation options and potential costs with the people that are getting flooded?
I think the best way to connect residents to this information is really, this is terrible to say, but I think the best thing is when it's not a sunny day, right? You get the most attention. After an event, folks are really concerned with these things. When it's a sunny day, it's really hard to grab attention. What happens is there's such limited education on the resident side. It's okay, I bought a home, I have to carry flood insurance. I'm not sure why, but I have to. That's usually the residents that we often see. So to communicate about the requirements of the flood ordinance, there's such a lack of understanding. So we hate to wait for those non-sunny days. So what we've tried to do is work with our municipalities first. And I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but it's really municipally driven. So if you can get your municipalities to understand this importance and what kind of funding is really out there to help their residents, which in turn helps your community, especially during a community assistance visit, that CAD visit that FEMA will do. What happens when you have so many severe repetitive loss structures or repetitive loss structures, it really hurts your community. So the best thing, my recommendation would be to really go to your community, get them educated on what kind of grant funds are out there, what they can do to help their residents, and then you get some listening ears. Because if I'm going to go to a municipal meeting, my municipality has invited me in because I am located in the special flood hazard area, and they have 25 menu of options for me. I'm willing to listen. You know, someone going to buy my home for fair market value when I typically had it on the market for a year and it won't sell because flood insurance premiums are so expensive.
Mm.
Does that help answer your question?
Yep.
I think something too to mention that I don't think we hit on, Terry, was, you know, these mitigation efforts, they aren't one size fits all. So it's not all inclusive that every structure can do every one of these 6, you know, efforts. A structure that may be able to be, you know, elevated or acquired and demolished may not be something that could be relocated. So I think that having the conversations with those individuals to see, you know, what their specific needs or wants are and what they are actually capable of doing, whether that be with private dollars or grant funds. I think that, you know, really remembering that taking the specific structure into consideration, it's not always one size fits all.
Excellent point. And with that, Geraldine, we have seen a lot of our municipalities send out surveys of there are some grant funding opportunities. You live in the special flood hazard area. Would you be interested in being on our list to talk to us about grant funding opportunities that may be available to you? That has worked decently.
And who could we, if we're a municipal leader, who could come in and provide information, the most current information about those funding opportunities, like do a presentation?
Erin, I'm going to pass this one on to you if you don't mind.
Can you please repeat the question?
So I like their idea of connecting to people in communities that flood and say, especially after a big flood event, and saying there are some great funding opportunities in your area of the municipality. We'd like to do a presentation to let you know about them. So who would be the entity? Would it be someone from PEMA that would come in and do the presentation of
It could possibly be PEMA. But honestly, the funding is made available for these programs through the municipality. The municipality needs to apply to PEMA, Pennsylvania Emergency Management, and the community. I'm not sure about buyouts. Do buyouts need to be part of the hazard mitigation plan or not to be qualified? They do? Okay.
Yeah, they do. So I was kind of throwing it to you to see how much SPC wants to be involved in those kinds of meetings, because typically what happens is if you're in a local development district like SPC may want to be at the table. And that's why I wanted to throw it to Erin. You know, they may want to be there and start that kind of discussion with PEMA to help you as one of their municipalities. I just don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. And so I'm a little careful of that. However, typically PEMA will come in, especially after a real event, because you have to do your substantial damage from a municipality standpoint. And then what will happen is they'll work through the HMGP. Now, hazard mitigation grant programs only after an event. It's a presidential disaster declaration. It's through the Stafford Act. But your FMA, your flood mitigation assistance, and your building resilient infrastructure communities, the BRIC program, open up every federal fiscal year, October 1. They're open currently, the FMA and the BRIC. The FMA is really by structure. So if you have properties in the special flood hazard area, and those homes you as a municipality want to either acquire and demo, or you want to help them elevate to keep that tax base, you can apply on their behalf if they're willing participants. It would be something that, of course, Jerry or I could help partner with SPC, do something virtually to get you up to speed on your municipal level. We will always be open to that. But I think the education really starts at the municipal level to know what grant funding there is out there, and then start to capture the right audience.
Okay.
Yeah, that Beth, we had a couple of webinars earlier in the year. I think in July we had one on the different grants available and the application process and the requirements for each one. You know, it is an ongoing effort to get folks to the table to start talking about these issues and how municipalities can assist their residents. A lot of times I've found that it's simply a staffing issue. There's not enough funding and staff to, you know, spend on these issues, especially if the majority of the municipality is not located in the floodplain. So that's a big part of it too. So it's just, you know, having these types of webinars and things to educate our municipalities. And if municipalities are interested in reaching out for additional assistance, you know, we're definitely happy to help in any way that we can. So it's like Terry and Jerry said, it's an education process, you know, and if residents are pushing their municipality to do something too, that always helps.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All of our contact information is in the slides. Jerry will get these over to Aaron for SPC to advertise on their website. And if there's any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to Aaron, myself, Terry, or Jerry. Thank you for watching the webinar and for entertaining us as well. Have a nice day.
Thank you.